Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to put the numbers on the table and have the kind of completely honest, completely direct, and completely unfiltered conversation that this quarterback situation has been building toward for weeks, because the statistical record that exists between these two quarterbacks is not ambiguous, is not subject to creative interpretation, and does not require any insider access or organizational sourcing to understand. The numbers are public. The footage is public. And when you lay them out side by side and examine them with the honest eyes of someone who actually wants to know the truth rather than confirm a predetermined narrative, the conclusion they point toward is so clear that the continued insistence from certain corners of this conversation that Deshaun Watson represents a better option than Shedeur Sanders for the Cleveland Browns in 2026 becomes genuinely difficult to explain through any lens other than the financial and organizational dynamics. We have been documenting throughout this entire offseason. Men lie. Women lie. Numbers do not. That is the standard we are going to apply here. Not opinion. Not practice reports from unnamed sources. Not carefully positioned organizational statements designed to manage a narrative. Numbers. Actual documented statistical performance from actual NFL games played against actual NFL competition. Because that is the only honest foundation for evaluating two quarterbacks competing for the same starting role, and it is the foundation that makes the case for Sanders so overwhelming that the continued public debate about whether Watson might be a superior option begins to look less like a legitimate football conversation and more like the product of the exact organizational dynamics and media relationships we have already identified as the driving forces behind the anti-Sanders narrative. Let us go through the statistical comparison that tells the story with the clarity that only numbers can provide. In the 7-game sample being examined, Shedeur Sanders threw for 1,100 passing yards. Deshaun Watson threw for 1,400 passing yards. Watson's passing yard advantage is real and deserves to be acknowledged honestly rather than minimized. He threw for more yards. That is a fact. But now let us look at what surrounds that number, because context is everything in statistical analysis and the surrounding numbers tell a story that the raw passing yard total cannot tell by itself. Yards per game. Sanders averaged 164 yards per game. Watson averaged 175 yards per game. The gap there is 11 yards per game, which is not a dramatic separation and which becomes even less significant when you examine the supporting cast and the offensive line protection each quarterback was operating behind during their respective periods of play, a point we will return to in a moment because it is absolutely central to understanding what these numbers actually mean. Touchdown passes. Sanders threw 5. Watson threw 7. Again, Watson's advantage is real and deserves honest acknowledgement. And now we arrive at the number that generates the most conversation, the number that gets cited most frequently by people arguing against Sanders, and that requires the most thorough and most honest examination of its full context to understand properly. Shedeur Sanders threw 10 interceptions. 10 interceptions. In 7 games. That is a significant number. It is a number that stands out immediately and that appears damaging at first glance. And if you stop at that number without examining what produced it, without looking at the specific circumstances and the specific receiver situations and the specific offensive line protection that existed around Sanders during the period those interceptions occurred, you walk away with a fundamentally incomplete and fundamentally misleading picture of what that number actually reflects about his capability as a quarterback. Here is what the honest and complete examination of that interception number reveals. Sanders was operating behind an offensive line that was demonstrably worse than the offensive line Watson had available to him during his comparable period of play. This is not a subjective assessment. This is an observable and documented reality about the protection environment each quarterback was working within. Sacks tell part of this story. Sanders took 33 sacks during his sample. Watson took 23. That is a difference of 10 sacks, which means Sanders was hit, hurried, and brought to the ground 10 more times than Watson was during comparable game situations. An offensive line that produces 10 additional sacks during a 7-game period is an offensive line that is creating significantly more pressure and significantly more instability in the pocket than the alternative, and pocket instability is one of the most consistent producers of interceptions in professional football because it forces quarterbacks into compressed decision windows, off-platform throws, and the kind of desperation releases that create turnover opportunities. But the offensive line is only part of the explanation for the interception total. The receiving corps surrounding Sanders during his period of play was, to state it as plainly as the evidence demands, a significant liability in ways that directly contributed to his turnover numbers. When a receiver runs the wrong route, the quarterback's read of the coverage leads him to deliver the ball to a location where a receiver is supposed to be, and when that receiver is not there, the ball either falls incomplete or gets intercepted by a defender who was in the right position because the route was run incorrectly. When a receiver drops a catchable ball and it deflects into a defender's hands, that becomes an interception credited to the quarterback even though the quarterback's decision and delivery were correct. When receivers cannot create separation consistently, quarterbacks are forced to throw into tighter windows with less margin for error, and tighter windows with less margin for error produce interceptions even when the quarterback's decision-making is sound. The receiving corps around Shedeur Sanders during his 7-game sample was generating exactly these kinds of problems at a rate that any honest evaluation of the situation has to factor into the analysis of his statistical performance. Drops were a documented issue. Route running consistency was a documented issue. The ability to create separation reliably was a documented issue. And all of those issues compounded on top of the offensive line problems to create a statistical environment around Sanders that was significantly more hostile to clean quarterback performance than the environment Watson was operating within during his comparable period. When you factor in the offensive line differential and the receiving corps reliability differential, the 10 interception number begins to look much less like evidence of Sanders' decision-making deficiencies and much more like the predictable statistical output of a quarterback operating behind inadequate protection with inadequate skill position support in a system that was not fully aligned around his development during that particular stretch of games. Now contrast that statistical environment with everything the Cleveland Browns have done this offseason to change it. Spencer Fano selected at number 9 to provide elite left tackle protection. The most athletic offensive tackle in the entire draft class. 0 sacks allowed in his entire college career. First in quarterback hits allowed among NCAA tackles with 800+ snaps. That offensive line upgrade directly addresses the protection problem that was producing the compressed decision windows and off-platform throws that contributed to the interception total. Casey Consumption and Denzel Boston added through the draft to provide legitimate receiving depth and competition at a position group that was producing the drops and the route running inconsistencies that were contributing to the turnover numbers. Tylan Wallace and Jamar Thrash added through free agency to further deepen a receiver room that needed the kind of genuine competition and talent infusion that transforms a liability into an asset. Joe Royer added as a receiving tight end to give the offense a new dimension and a new matchup problem that defenses have to account for, which opens up space for receivers working elsewhere in the formation. The entire offensive infrastructure was rebuilt around correcting the specific problems that produced the statistical numbers being cited against Sanders. The people actually responsible for building this team looked at the same numbers everyone else is looking at, understood what produced them, and spent their draft capital and their free agency resources fixing the problems rather than using the numbers as justification for replacing the quarterback those problems surrounded. That is what an organization does when it correctly diagnoses the difference between a quarterback who is producing disappointing statistics because his support infrastructure is inadequate and a quarterback who is producing disappointing statistics because he is not good enough. It fixes the support infrastructure. And the Cleveland Browns front office, through the entire body of their offseason work, demonstrated that their diagnosis was the former rather than the latter. Now let us look at Watson's numbers with the same honest examination we apply to Sanders, because fairness demands it and because the contrast is genuinely illuminating. Watson threw for 1,400 yards and 7 touchdowns in his 7-game sample. Those numbers look better than Sanders' numbers in the raw statistical comparison. But Watson was operating behind a better offensive line, taking 23 sacks compared to Sanders' 33, in a better protection environment. And he still produced numbers that, when you adjust for that protection advantage, do not reflect the kind of elite quarterback performance that would justify the organizational investment his contract represents. More damning than the statistical comparison is the footage. And the footage of Watson's play during his period of starting has been available for anyone willing to watch it honestly. The accuracy issues. The decision-making concerns. The throws that made even casual observers uncomfortable with their direction and their placement. The overall picture of a quarterback whose best football may be significantly behind him in ways that no off-season practice performance can fully address or reverse. And yet certain voices in the Cleveland media environment, voices with sources that trace to organizational levels above the coaching staff based on the pattern of information flow we have been documenting, are asking Cleveland Browns fans to believe that this same quarterback is outperforming Shedeur Sanders in practices that none of those fans can attend or verify, based on reports from sources whose identity and organizational standing have been consistently obscured. The numbers say Sanders is the better option when properly contextualized. The footage says Sanders is the better option when watched honestly. The organizational investment of the entire draft class says Sanders is the better option because you do not spend a top 10 pick on blindside protection for a quarterback you do not intend to start. The coaching staff's evaluative investment, the helmet camera, the first team reps, the commitment to resolving the competition before the end of camp, says Sanders is the better option because those are not the behaviors of a coaching staff indifferent about who takes the first snap of the 2026 season. And the continued insistence that Watson is winning this competition, sourced through channels that do not originate from the people actually making this football decision, reflects exactly the organizational dysfunction and narrative management we have been identifying throughout this entire offseason. Could you imagine being Shedeur Sanders right now? Could you genuinely sit with that question for a moment and process what it means? You came out of Colorado having demonstrated the kind of elite competitive quarterbacking that put your father and your fan base in a position to believe with complete conviction that you were going to walk into the NFL and be exactly what your talent suggested you could be. You got drafted. You showed up. You worked. You took first team reps, you wore the helmet camera. You handled the controversy with more dignity than anyone had a right to expect from someone your age navigating what you were navigating. You graduated with your degree. You posted about elevation. You planned to continue your education. And in return, you are watching an organization apparently consider starting a quarterback over you whose statistical record in comparable game situations does not justify that decision, whose engagement with this team has been publicly questionable throughout the entire offseason, and whose continued roster presence appears driven by a $230 million contract obligation rather than by any honest football evaluation of who gives the Cleveland Browns the best chance to win games in 2026. That is genuinely distasteful. And the people responsible for it, whether through their reporting or through the organizational decisions they are making or the narratives they are feeding to reporters, should be held accountable for what they are doing to a young quarterback who has earned better treatment through every observable measure available. The preseason is coming. The numbers are on record. The footage exists. And when those preseason games are played and the truth of this competition is finally visible to everyone simultaneously without the filter of organizational spin or media narrative construction, the statistical and performance record that exists for both quarterbacks will be the foundation against which every preseason snap gets evaluated. Sanders has the better foundation heading into that evaluation when you understand what produced his numbers and what has been done to fix the problems around him. The numbers say it. The organizational investment says it. The coaching staff's evaluative behavior says it. Everything except certain voices with certain agendas says it. And those voices, the receipts are being kept.